Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Lucidity. If you haven't met me before, I am a PhD student in Japanese history. I don't know if I've said this before, but I focus primarily on the occupation of Japan. So this is 1945 to 1952, when Japan was under the control of the US government. And I focus on feminism and feminist activism. I'm particularly looking at suffrage, so the expansion of women's political rights, particularly as Japanese feminists go out into the countryside and galvanize people to vote on that day. And I kind of look into articles that are written in magazines and journals and newspapers encouraging women to vote from all, different backgrounds, whether it's, upper class housewives or lower class working women and factory workers and farmers and things like that. So because this is my background, I found it really interesting that Japanese women, for the first time, a Japanese woman has been elected Prime Minister of Japan. And it says here, so her name is Takaichi Sanae, and she was finally, I think, started on, and it says the 21st October 2025. I'm not sure if that's when she was elected or when her start date, but she is the first woman prime minister in Japan. And my work is centered around women getting the right to vote for the first time, women getting elected into office for the first time. And this is a really interesting fact for me. And I wanted to talk about it because I had a very interesting conversation with my professor. And basically, I said, hey, I just found out that for the first time ever, a woman was elected prime minister of Japan. And he says, yeah, but she's like running on the backs of like this anti-foreign, anti-immigrant policy, and she's extremely nationalist, and she's not really a great person, I guess, in his opinion. And to which I say, I actually kind of think that's irrelevant to how interesting it is that a woman has finally been elected prime minister. Because to be fair, the LDP, the party that she stands for, has been primarily, other than two occasions, in power since the end of World War II. And they've all been nationalists, and they've all been very, they all have ties to the imperial government pre the end of the war. They're, Abe's grandfather was Nobunosuke Kishi, which is a war criminal. This is not new. And there was never going to be a prime minister who is a woman of Japan that was not going to be from the LDP. That would have been incredibly rare and not share the same values of her party. So I feel like there's no perfect person, perfect woman that would have won that position, right? Which begs the question, right? Is this a win for feminism? Right? And that's a very interesting question, because I think nowadays feminism is a very loaded word. And I'm going to explain to you how I use feminism in a historical context in my research. And you can kind of take that for how you want to, because there's so much controversy, even amongst historians, especially in places outside the Western world, who maybe don't like the term feminism or don't like its associations with bourgeois white feminism in the US or in Europe. And there's all sorts of things with that. But for me, when I'm talking about feminism, I'm talking about two things, right? For one, feminism is a idea, a category. Calling yourself a feminist is something in history that these women referred to themselves as, right? So during the suffragette movement, they would have referred to themselves as feminists. So I'm looking at a category of people that are self-defined, and I'm looking at how they're engaging in politics from their perspective, right? Even the category of woman, for me, woman is a political category. Now, I'm not here to fight anybody on how they want to define it. I personally don't define it as a biological category. I think that gender as a category itself is something that's socially constructed personally. And I think that when I'm defining it as a political category, I'm defining it as something that the government, the state, defines and then creates laws based off of that definition and puts people into those categories and treats them according to the categories that they have created. So the government will decide who gets to be a woman and who gets to be a man, and then gives rights according to those categories. So because you were biologically born of the female sex, or, you know, with the chromosomes or whatnot, the government decides that that makes you a woman. And as a woman, you are all these other things that they've decided that that means. And they've decided that that means you don't get to vote. Men get to vote, and women are supposed to be the property of men, like going far into the past, right? They're making these definitions of what a woman is and how she should relate to men and in society, in their government, in the state, right? Especially when you're looking at, I'm primarily looking at Meiji Japan, which is when Japan opens up to the West and they kind of constitute themselves as an imperial nation, and they decide what does nation mean? What does it mean to have an emperor? What does it mean to have citizens? And what do all those categories mean? And that includes men and women and what level of political agency they're allowed to have, right? So I'm looking at it from that perspective. So when women are identifying as feminists, it's because there were laws in place at the time that said women as a category were not allowed to be political agents. They were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to meet and organize, and they were not allowed to run for office. And therefore, they're fighting against these laws that are prohibiting them for having those rights. So that's how I'm looking at it. Now, using the category like of feminism today, feminism has changed over time. I'm looking more at first wave feminism. I kind of think that 1945, that post-war period in Japan, is an extension of that first wave of feminism. You have another movement in the 60s and 70s of feminism. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on then. And then you have like these new waves. You have radical feminism. There's all sorts of things. And that term, that idea, what it means, changes over time. Right? And so that's what makes this question really confusing when I say, is this a win for feminism? I think that how women in Japan in 1945 would see this moment, if you were to say, oh, well, you're not going to have a woman prime minister until the year 2025, which is so far ahead from where they're like 50, 75 years into the future, right? And how women today that might self-identify as feminists might have a different idea of what that means and might not think it's quite so feminist. Or there are people that are Marxist feminism and don't think that, like, under capitalism you can truly be feminist because capitalism is hurting men and women. There's a whole bunch of things going with that, but that's not how I'm looking at it. I'm looking at it in this particular way. And I also, the second thing that I do is that I particularly like to use the definition from Joan Scott. And if you have ever heard of Joan Scott, she's a historian. She wrote Gender as a Category of Analysis in the 1980s. It's one of the most cited articles, if not the most cited article of all time as far as history goes in academic sources. And she basically defines gender and how she looks at gender as this relationship between power, right? And she says that basically women exercise agency even when they're under systems of power that deny them basic freedoms. And so when you're looking at patriarchy, say like there's all these authors that look at maybe like Neo-Confucian Japan, or if you want to call it that, or, Neo-Confucian Korea, and basically this like pre-modern, the Edo period, Tokugawa period, the feudal period of Japan, let's say, and how that society is patriarchal for samurai women, maybe not for women that are in the merchant class and the other thing, but like, so samurai women are not allowed to hold office or do these other things, right? But what they are allowed to do is art, writing, finding different ways to kind of go against those systems of power and exercise agency. And agency is being able to choose what you want to do with your life, having that expansion of choices to be able to live a life that's according to your own desires. That's an exercise of agency. So if you're like, I don't want to just focus on my life as a wife and mother, like the way that Meiji Japan in the late 1800s says, I want to actually go out and speak about politics, and I'm going to do that maybe in a secret group, or I'm going to do it through, because I can't like organize in more of like a public way. I'm going to do it with like writing, and I'm going to write articles, and we're going to talk about it. Like, this is the stuff that happens in the Taisho period in the 1910s, when women are writing about topics relating to women in different magazines, especially Seito magazine. And they're having all sorts of discussions about how, like, maybe rights should be extended to women, or maybe we should have social services for women. Those are ways that women exercise agency, even when they're in a system that they can't change. And that's something that after Joan Scott started talking about agency and talking about power relations, more historians started applying that to the way that they looked at history. And rather than seeing women as just victims, seeing the ways in which women challenged their that structure, even when they can't overtake the structure or like be in that position of power, right? So when I'm looking at women fighting in 1945 for the right to vote, maybe they don't have positions of power in government. Maybe they don't have the ability to be in the Diet, the national Diet, which is Japan's government, and making those laws change. But what they can do is that they can create organizations, go into the countryside, encourage women to vote, write magazines, do all those things. That's the way they're exercising agency, even when they don't have like upper levels of power. This is like a bit of a simplified way of explaining it, but I've wrote a lot of papers and articles and stuff about it. So when I'm thinking about Takaichi getting this role as the new prime minister, I think about whether or not this is expanding agency for women, right? So even though, say, patriarchal structures limit the possibilities for women, when you expand those possibilities by changing something, like it was just assumed that men would never be in a position of power like this, but now we see women in this position, so now other women have the opportunity to imagine themselves in that role. And now, like, the men at the top of power can say, okay, you know what, we can push a woman candidate, or we can choose a woman for this office, right? Like, that expands things for women in a way that they didn't before. And by comparison, right, okay, do you guys remember when Katy Perry went to space and she tried to say that it was like a win for feminism to have all those like women in space? But it was through a private company, through like Jeff Bezos, and I think everybody saw right through that. And the reason why I don't consider that feminist, according to my definition of what I've just been saying, is because she didn't expand anything for women. So she's kind of making this like argument from her perspective. Like, if little girls see me in space, then they will have that imagination, like, oh, now I can go to space too, right? In the same way that like little girls looking up to the new prime minister in Japan might say, oh, actually, this is something I can accomplish. I can dream of this. I can do this again. Like, with Katy Perry, I think it was pretty obvious that no one got an additional like possibility and a new thing that they could do. It was, she got that because she was a person of influence and a person who has money. And private space travel only increases possibilities for people with money, not for women specifically. Maybe if you're a woman who has money, sure. But it wasn't a uniquely thing, like a thing uniquely for women, that having private space travel was like helping women specifically just because women were the face of that. What we were really seeing was, this is how the billionaires and people with excessive wealth are able to have access to things that women that don't have that access to normally would not be able to. Like, no one really got anything more than they already had, which was, rich people getting to do whatever they want, basically, right? So I think that, right, historically in Japan, women have had one of the lowest rates in the entire world of being able to be in political office. And there's even been talks about having like the quota system that sort of forces political parties to add more women to their platform. And I feel like this is a big deal because, I mean, even the United States hasn't have a female president. And so Japan is doing something that other people haven't, like certain people haven't done. Okay, just the US. And maybe some like really repressive countries somewhere else, right? But okay, I think it's okay. No, I don't think it's okay that she's like this extreme, that she's coming in this period of this like extreme lean towards anti-immigration. A lot of this is happening because of post-COVID. There's been way too many tourists in Japan. There's particularly in Kyoto, not so much everywhere else, but it's just like over tourism and the infrastructure just can't handle that. And the solution would be probably to fix the infrastructure or to make other parts of Japan look just as appealing so that the tourists can kind of spread out. But instead, of course, what you get is local people getting mad that there's more tourists in their area, and they just become even more anti-immigrant, and that floods with all these other, not that they haven't been anti-immigrant in other ways. Like Japan notoriously has had issues where there were people that, like anti-Korean, in any country that has former colonies, there's always a section of that population, this is not unique to Japan, that rejects the people from those colonies that end up living there. And that was something that happened with Koreans and with Chinese people from Manchuria and whatnot. But I think like the recent surge in that anti-immigrant nationalist talking point has to do with the over-tourism post-COVID. Even though I don't think it's the majority of Japanese people. I think a lot of people in Japan nowadays are politically kind of apathetic. And the people that are into politics tend to just be heavily nationalist, but I don't think that represents the whole of people in Japan, I'll just say. What I think it is more that, like, it's still a remarkable point that a woman has become prime minister, even if she's not a good person. Because men are allowed to be not good people and still have political office, right? Like, the point is not whether she's great as a human being, which, I don't know her, but like, again, if you disagree with her policies, that's such a valid point. But the point is that women are now allowed to be bad people too and have power, right? Like, let women be villains, because men have been villains for years. They're monopolizing the villain industry. And there are good men. We just had an election in New York, and Mamdani is incredibly popular. Not every politician has a lot of backlash, yes, but there are male politicians that people love, and there are male politicians people despise, including other people in the US that are in positions of power. Women are allowed and should be allowed to have opportunities to things, even if they're not a good person. That shouldn't be a barrier, because it's not a barrier for men. Does that make sense? I believe that we should all have the same opportunities, regardless, and like, there shouldn't be a personality exam beforehand. Like, you should be able to do it. It's still a point that you should be able to criticize anybody that's in political office. That is 1000% the case. You should be criticizing male or female politicians. But the idea that she is a woman should not be a part of it. We should not even be, we should just be looking at her policies. We should just be looking at her as a person and then criticizing her based off of her terrible policies. And the fact that she's a woman, it should be unremarkable. And so that's what's cool, is that women are allowed to also be put up to that level of scrutiny. Why don't we say? And then we can just criticize the party as a whole, or Japanese politics as a whole, just like any other politics, just like any other party in the world, just, you know what I mean? So, yeah, I don't think women should be perfect in order to have their accomplishments recognized. I think that, like taking Mamdani as an example, I think even if you despise him, I would still respect the fact that he's like the youngest mayor, the first Muslim mayor, the first, like he's doing so many, like the first, like the fact that he beat Cuomo, like it is still something to go, wow, this is really interesting, even if you didn't like him. And I think it's okay to acknowledge those things, even if you disagree with somebody. It's like, I remember when Nikki Haley was running. First of all, I wasn't a huge Hillary fan, personally. I preferred Bernie at the time, right? And this is not about, like, I don't want to get it into a big thing. The point is that had she won, I still would have said, it's good that we have the first female president. Now we can have women in that position, and it will feel like it's not a big deal. It's natural, like, and I mean, give it to Hillary. She was the first woman to really run as a candidate and have that opportunity. And then so when other women are going up for that, now it's not a question. Like Kamala did it and it wasn't even a big deal, right? Nikki Haley, right? Like, I personally don't vote Republican. I kind of, I preferred her to the alternative within her own party, and I would have supported her within her own party had she been that candidate. I would have still, if she would have won, even if I wasn't a Republican, I would have still said, Nikki Haley, that's cool that we have a woman president. Whether it was Hillary, whether it was Nikki Haley, whether it was Kamala Harris, and these are all different ends of the spectrum, it still would have been a historic moment, and they're allowed to claim that, in my opinion, even if I agree or disagree with any of their policies or whatnot, right? And that's what I kind of think, that I can still say, oh, what a good thing that Japan has their first female prime minister, even though I don't agree with like a lot of her policies, right? Or the direction that the LDP is trending in, because it's trending really nationalist. But and I think that's just how I think we should be holding every politician to scrutiny, like I said before, regardless. Their gender shouldn't be an issue. So let me check if I have any notes here of anything else I wanted to say. No, I think that was it. I got it all done in 22 minutes. So I am very curious to hear what you have to say about this issue. I think, like, I don't think there's a right answer. I think you're free to kind of believe otherwise. And I would be really interested to hear what you have to say about whether or not you think we should still celebrate, the expansion of opportunities, or, even ones that are just kind of in the imagination of like, oh, now that this thing has happened, that means other people can easily envision it. I think that's still significant, right? Or if you think like, no, just like, don't celebrate anybody or any of it. Just, it's not even a point worth talking about. I don't know what people are thinking. And maybe there's like an angle to it that I'm not considering, but I'm definitely not like supporting anyone's policies in particular by noting the historical significance. I mean, I personally feel like of them winning, or of them being in that role. All right, so like and subscribe, I guess, all of the things, if you want me to yap with my microphone. And please leave some comments if you have anything you want to say on this topic. And I have more stuff to talk about later. All right, bye-bye.